Good afternoon. My name is Diane Varga, and I am with Family Partners of Morris and Sussex Counties. I would like to welcome you to our weekly Lunch and Learn program on Thursday, April 1st, 2021. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We are going to keep everyone on mute unless you are speaking. We encourage you to utilize the chat function if you have any questions or comments. I will be keeping an eye on the chat function for our presenter, along with my coworker, Margarita Acosta, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording today's meeting, which will be shared with you following the event, plus any resources that our presenter provides. Today's topic is how sensory processing differences might be impacting your child's behavior and social emotional well-being. Our presenter today is Michele Parkins. Michele Parkins is an occupational therapist and owner of Great Kids Place in Rockaway, New Jersey. Michele specializes in working with children and families impacted by differences in sensory processing and challenges in social emotional development. Michele teaches and assists in the design of the certification courses in sensory processing and integration, educating therapists worldwide. She is also assisting with the standardization and development of the latest assessment for sensory processing disorder, soon to become the gold standard for identification of SPD and supporting research. In addition to her impressive professional resume, it is important to note that Michele is also a mother of 2 children with sensory processing differences. She uses her real-life experiences to help her clients better understand the impact of SPD on family dynamics, relationships, and the day-to-day demands of life with sensory processing differences. It is my pleasure to introduce Michele Parkins.
Thank you. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to do a full share here. Where is it? Sometimes that's hard to do that when we're first starting. So thank you for the introduction. I don't have to go through any of this now, which is nice. Saves a little bit of time. But I think that the main thing that I want to add to that is that my framework of this presentation always is both from professional and as mother, but also from somebody who comes from mental health training as well. And I think that it's important to know that in the sense that there is such a strong overlap between sensory processing differences and mental health. And sometimes, very often we need to work with our mental health colleagues to help support the whole child when we're looking at sensory processing differences. So you might find yourself in this presentation kind of wondering about different diagnoses. And we'll cover that a little bit. But really, ultimately, what is the big part to understand is that everything is connected, right? So sensory processing can be a standalone challenge from like a diagnostic perspective, but it can also be something that is a part of several other things that are happening developmentally with kids. So I will definitely answer specific questions about that at the end, but I wanted to preempt saying that because I feel like it's a question that we get pretty often. Okay, so here we go. So I like to give, it's usually we have like a little range of experience with sensory processing. So I like to give a little bit of definitions at the beginning just to say that this is what I mean when I say these words. So when I'm talking about sensory processing, I'm talking about it as a developmental process. It's only a disorder if it's impacting daily life, right? So we all have a range of the way that we process the world. And what this means is that all of our sensory systems give information into our central nervous system, right? So we have the ones that we learned since kindergarten: sound, sight, taste, smell, touch. And then there are a few others that are ones that we don't learn about. And usually we don't have to worry about these because they do their job and we don't need to think about them or know about them. I'm going to go into those just a little bit so that when you hear the terms, you know what I mean. So we just talked about this a bit. So I think the important part to know about sensory processing is that we all do it a little bit differently, right? So we all perceive our world, even if we're in the same exact spot, slightly different than the person sitting next to us. Okay. And what that does for us is gives us our perception of the world. So the information comes in to our body, we make sense of it based on the information that we receive to then know what our perception of the world is. And when we know that there's a big difference is when I love talking to teachers and childcare workers because they have a room full of kids that are about the same age. And when a teacher or childcare worker points out that there's a difference in the way that a child is behaving compared to their peers, then what we want to know is, how is that child perceiving the world? Because they're acting on the way that they are understanding the world around them. And that's what we need to understand. How are they taking in information from the environment and from their body to create that perception of the world that they are in? So those senses that we don't often learn about, the first one is the vestibular sense. And this is primarily our balance sense, and it's our, you can think of it as your body's GPS system. So it's located in our inner ear. Doesn't really have anything to do with hearing. It's there because the primary role is to keep our brain safe, right? So when we start to move anywhere off of that base of support, that vestibular system says you're moving so that you can do something about it, right? So that's kind of why it's housed there. But ultimately, it is guides our actions through space. It gives us our perception of all spatial relationships, both within our body, but then it really translates down to spatial understanding on the paper, right? So it's really common that we see challenges in the vestibular system when we see difficulties in things like keeping our sentences on the line, coloring in the space that we're provided. So if we don't understand space through our body, then it's really hard to conceptualize that, to understand it abstractly in something that we're doing that's not with our body. Our proprioceptive system is information from our muscles and joints. So every single time we do something, all of these little receptors in our muscles and joints send information to our brain that gives us our body map. So the vestibular system is more our understanding of ourself in space, and a greater space. Proprioceptive system is our body on ourselves, right? So where is our head in relation to our trunk? Where are our feet in relation to our legs? And when I'm moving through space to do something with my hands and my arms, where are they then in relation to the other parts of my body? So the proprioceptive sense is used all the time, and really strongly when we're not using our vision, which is, as adults, a lot, right? So anything that we do that's like a practiced activity, we have proprioceptive memory of how to do that, which is why we don't have to pay attention to what we're doing, right? We can do what we need to do. We can get ready. We can do our routine. We can sometimes even like type an email while we're having a conversation, right? Because we've got a map within our body of what we need to do, what actions we have to execute. Our touch sense, it's, certainly what it is, right? That we use it to touch things and understand things through our touch, but it also is our major body map, because it's all over, right? Our skin is all over our body. And anytime we move, even the gentle breeze that's created as we move gives information to our skin that gives information about our body map and how we're moving and what we're doing. So I like to refer to our visual sense as the checker. And the reason is that, yes, we use it for seeing, yes, we use it for reading and everything else, but we also use it, its primary concern always is your own safety. So when our body systems, our proprioceptive, vestibular, and touch systems are not online in a way that is effective, then our visual system automatically pays attention to us, right? And I say that because when we have attention difficulties or somebody not looking at us or sharing attention with us, we also want to know, what are they visually attending to, right? And often if there's a sensory processing difference, they're visually attending to what they're doing. So a practical example of this that we've experienced as adults is, if you're walking down the street and you don't typically have to watch your feet, right? You can be on your phone, you can be talking to the person next to you, you can be looking around, but as soon as you stumble, you look, right? Because your visual system says, okay, that was not what I expected to happen. The body systems did not support my understanding about where I am in space. So I need to check in and figure out what's going on. So imagine for a second, a little precursor to what we'll talk about moving forward. Imagine not feeling that way all the time, right? Imagine that you're tripping all the time and that you don't know why. And your visual system is constantly checking in with your own body. And then imagine being asked to share attention with somebody else and how that might feel. Okay, so why is this all important? I alluded to this a little bit in the beginning. The next visual is a little overwhelming. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I think it's important to see as a whole, and you will have an opportunity to have this handout so you can actually dive into it a little bit deeper if you want to. But essentially, the things that we are concerned with as parents and the things that professionals are concerned with about our children are the things up at the top, right? Joy in life, relationships, being able to do routines, being able to carry out what we need to do in our role, whatever role that is, as a student, as a daughter, as a son, as a sister, as a brother, as a playmate, um, and being able to communicate, engage in social engagement, have emotional regulation and emotional control, right? These are the things that we hear about very often in our practice as concerns. And sometimes we'll look at skills, right? We might look at fine motor skills and gross motor skills, and what is your ability to do the things that we're asking you to do in order to participate in those activities of life. But below that are these sensory systems. So in order to develop efficient fine motor and gross motor skills, we have to be processing information from our sensory systems accurately. So that the information that comes into our sensory systems gives us motor control to do the actions that we need to do with those skills. So from a sensory processing perspective, these sensory systems are extremely foundational to all of the things that we do developmentally. Okay, so the other part I like to talk about is, so if you came to this presentation or heard about it, or you've heard sensory processing disorder in the past or heard sensory processing, most commonly thought is sensory over responsive, sensory sensitivities, right? Kids that are holding their ears or will only wear certain clothes or won't eat certain foods, or uncomfortable moving, right? Don't want to be picked up, that kind of thing. And I like to point this out, and we'll definitely be understanding this way more by the end of this presentation, is that it's really just a small piece of it, right? That's really just a small piece of sensory processing, which is taking in information, the amount of at which we take in information. And that is very important because we need to take in the right amount of information in order to do everything else. But that's a piece of it that we'll learn more. And then just kind of looking all the way on the right here, motor coordination and motor skills are usually the things we can see. And just knowing that all of these things are happening before we even get to that. So now we're going to go into each of these areas: the amount, the quality, the posture, and the motor planning, and what that means. So, sensory over responsive, as I just mentioned, is being overly sensitive to stimuli, typically stimuli that does not seem aversive to other people, right? So, things that happen in daily life that are not even a thing for other people, right? Could be a smell, could be a sound, could be a touch, could be a movement, right? Could be, and these can happen in any of those sensory systems. What typically happens here and is that we are very concerned and worried and about what's going to happen to us, right? So these are our kids who tend to be pretty anxious as well. So when we think of this as a more of like on a spectrum, the majority of people around this person would register stuff about in the middle, right? We hear something, we see something, we smell something, we feel something. We all like look and pay attention to it at about the same time. This person responds to it way before all of us. Okay. And for way longer than all of us. And the opposite side of that is, oh, I'm sorry. On the opposite side of that is sensory under responsive, meaning that the child responds less than you would expect to something that happens in everyday life. Okay. What an example of this could be: the kiddo that bumps into things all the time, and you go, oh, and they go, what? Right? Just not really recognizing that that even happened. So I like to use the example of sound here because it's something that we think we've all experienced. And usually we're all in the same room when we do this kind of presentation. And I'll say something like refer to somebody walking in the room. So let's pretend for a second we're all in the same room. We hear the door. Okay, we hear the door open. It might make a creaking sound. The majority of us would turn to look, right? Because we're curious. We're curious as humans about what's going on around us. The person who's over responsive would startle, right? The person who's under responsive would go, what's everybody looking at? Right? And then maybe turn to look because they see the social cues of everybody else looking at it. Okay, so let's go back one. So other examples of sensory over-responsivity. So these are our individuals who have difficulty with clothing, difficulty in most self-care activities, brushing hair, cutting nails, wiping face, taking showers, bathing, putting soap on their body, lotion, that kind of thing. Don't really prefer getting messy, can also be pretty aversive to other people's touch, right? This is their child who kind of cowers when you're kissing and hugging, and as parents, our general response is to rub our kids when they're upset, right? We give them little rubs or we say hi, and we use a lot of light touch as we parent. These are our kids who are, stop, and as soon as we get that light touch, or doing one of these when we go to give them a kiss. They do not like busy and cluttered environments. Again, foods could be a challenge, sounds in the daily repertoire, vacuums, clicking, ticking clocks, blenders, even outside landscape equipment, that kind of thing. So the important part is it doesn't have to be all of these, right? So you can have an over response in one system and you can have an under response in another system. And that's actually more common than the opposite. Usually we see that there are differences across all sensory systems. And that's because they all work together, right? So if we have an over response in one system or an under response in another system, the other systems need to do something to compensate for that system because we need all of them in order to function. So that's why it's different. We see these differences across the systems. So it's pretty uncommon to just have one of these. Okay, so some examples of under-responsive, in addition to sort of the example I gave about bumping into something, but having difficulty determining temperatures, not noticing that they didn't wipe their face off after they finished eating or that they're coming into the house completely dirty, not noticing somebody entering the room. A lot of times parents will refer to these children as in their own world and just or slow and behind the person, everything, just needing to constantly give them reminders to hurry up. As they start to get dressed or use or potty train, then we start to see the clothes are just disheveled all the time. There really isn't a recognition from the body that nothing, that item of clothing is not fitting the way that it should on the body. So there needs a lot of reminders for daily life. Okay, so that's our what we call the modulation, right? So our modulation or our registration of sensory input. Once we are there, right? Once we've got the information, then we need to figure out a lot of information about it, right? So if I heard a sound, I want to know where it came from, how long did it happen, what was the details, right? Did somebody say me to look at a cat or somebody tell me to put on a cap, right? There's a difference in the two words that we need to distinguish. And then how long is it going to happen and when is it going to stop and when is it going to happen again, right? So we need to know all of these, the duration, the frequency, the timing, the intensity, and where it came from for all of our sensations. So I think that's kind of easier to understand when we think about touch and sound, even smell, taste, right? Where that came from, what it's all about. Now, when we think about this, the body systems, the vestibular and proprioceptive systems, we need to think a little bit more about that, right? Because what does that mean? Because that's something that's coming from within our body. And I like to use the example of boogie boarding. So hopefully you guys have all done it. It may have been a while. It's actually an activity that I always tell my kids I don't want them to stop because then I have to stop because I find it really fun. And I think it would be really weird if it was just adults doing it, next to all the kids at the shore. But so we're thinking about boogie boarding. This is a colleague of mine, Renee Allen from the Star Institute, uses this, and I just love it so much. But so you're holding onto your boogie board in the ocean, okay, and you hear the waves coming, and you have to discriminate how far is that wave, right, from the sound. You can also use the input of touch system on your body of the feeling, right? You can feel the wave, and you can determine the spatial orientation of the wave by the feeling of it coming out and in, right? That kind of sucking back and pushing forward on your skin and in your proprioceptive system as the waves are moving. You have to figure out how hard are you supposed to squeeze the boogie board so it doesn't fly out from under your body and out of your hands, right? So what is that right amount of pressure that I'm supposed to use, and where do I put it on my body, right? How do I place it against my body in the just right place so that I can get onto it and that it doesn't go without me? And then once we get on the boogie board, we have to decide where, right? How much of my body needs to be on this thing so that I don't fall off. And then we start moving, and that vestibular system kicks in to determine how fast are we going, how close are we to the shore, when do I have to jump, right? How long am I going to move with this wave? And when can I stay on my boogie board and not land on the shore? Or do I need to get off of this so that I don't land on the shore? So all of these little tiny details are happening instantaneously when we boogie board, but also throughout the day, right? Anytime we're doing any motor action, we're constantly getting feedback from our vestibular and proprioceptive system that makes little tiny adjustments so that we can do it efficiently. So what does it look like if this doesn't work? Very significant coordination difficulty. So our pacing and our timing is off. We can do things, right? We do things, and usually these kids will, in a normal developmental exam, like at the pediatrician say, will check off their skills, right? Can they jump? Yes. Can they write? Yes. Can they stand on one foot? Yes. Can they catch a ball? Yes, right? We can do it. But when you really look at the way they're doing it, it's often pretty clumsy. The timing is slightly off. The stability is slightly off. There's more wobbling that you would expect. There's difficulty with any kind of ball sports, typically, right? Because that's a lot of pacing and timing. Any sport that happens with another person that you need to time and organize your actions based on somebody else's movements. Quite often things like writing and using utensils, because we need to really figure out how much force that we're supposed to use when we use those things. Okay, so we see there's this inefficiency in movement, and often a pretty confused state that comes with that, just not quite sure why they can't do it exactly the way everybody else is doing it. Okay, so the discrimination one in particular really lends itself to our next two areas, which are the things that we can see, right? We can't really see the amount of input our body's taking in. We can't really see how our body's discriminating information. But what we can see is the motor response, right? What we can see is posture and stability. So some people refer to this as core strength, right? Again, a small part of it. It is core strength, but it's also how do we move about our base of support, right? How do we move about our trunk and our core so that we are able to maintain an upright position, but also fluidly move our arms, fluidly move our legs in a way that allows us to do all that pacing and timing that I just mentioned, right? So it really is that the stability supports our efficient mobility. So an example of that is if we have core stability and postural stability and we go to throw a ball, we are able to work from this base to reach our arm back and move forward to throw, really not often moving off of this, moving our base, right? When we don't have it, it looks something like this, right? Our whole entire body moves forward. And what that means is that we're moving on momentum. What that means is we can't control that because once it's in motion, right? We're whole body into that action. It also means that we're getting tired quicker because we're moving way more than we need to. Okay, it's not efficient. So some other difficulties here we see with difficulty using two hands, anything that uses two hands. Again, our little guys, what typically happens, and even some of the older kids, they'll use one hand to stabilize their body. Okay, so if our little guys who are learning how to sit by themselves, or even our 2 and 3 year olds who are starting to learn how to put their clothes on, their shoes on, their socks on, if they're asked to sit on the floor and put their socks or their shoes on, but they can't stabilize, they're going to roll over, right? They're going to roll backwards, and then so they know this, and they usually will prop themselves up on one hand. Well, how do you put your socks and shoes on with one hand, right? You really can't. It's really hard, and so we start to see this pattern of stabilizing with one hand, using the other hand, right? So we don't get a lot of practice with that bilateral coordination, using one hand to stabilize, one hand to use, using two hands at the same time to do something. So writing, utensils, lots of dressing difficulties, buttoning, fasteners, all of those things require efficient use of two hands together. Sitting at the table for any extended period of time, right? We see the slumped on the table, we see the leaning back on we see falling out of the chair, right? So many teachers talk to us about their kids falling out of the chair. So they're feeling just a little loose, a little floppy. It's circle time. They're laying on the person next to them, right? Because they can't sit up without the support of a chair. And as the kids get older, what happens too is that we see some difficulty with reading and some difficulty with shifting from smartboard to tabletop, right? So the eyes are fine motor, just like our hands. So if we don't have a stable base for our eyes to work off of, we see those challenges and that kind of thing too, right? So if we're reading, we're really expecting our body to be stable and our eyes to do these little ticking actions across the page, which is a fine motor act that requires a gross motor stability. Our next and final area is our, which is referred to as praxis. Motor planning is another word. Dyspraxia is the word for when it's not working, right? And this is a huge area that we could spend an hour or more on just in and of itself. But essentially, the short of it is having an idea or being given a direction, developing a plan for that, executing the plan, and then adapting it when we need to, right? And I underline this adapting because that's usually the big challenging piece for our kids with sensory processing differences, which typically causes all of our emotional regulation challenges, right? Is something doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, something doesn't happen the way they expect it to happen, and then I don't know what else to do, right? So everything feels really terrible in that moment because I don't know how to fix it. So these are difficulty following multiple step directions, learning new skills. Typically, we'll see a pretty repetitive play pattern where we either get stuck in really early play, like filling things up and dumping them out, or throwing, or building and knocking down, right? That super early type of experimental play, we get stuck there because it's cause and effect and it's one step. I do this, something happens. It's rewarding. Anything beyond that early experimentation sensory motor play requires multiple steps, right? And when we get to that multiple step piece, everything gets jumbled up and confused. So we see challenges with riding bikes, riding a tricycle, playing on the playground, going to a new playground and knowing what to do on the equipment, coming up with ideas in general, right? So our older kids with motor planning difficulties are their I'm bored kids, right? That you expect them to be able to find something to do to entertain themselves and they can't. We see a lot of challenges with dressing and eating for these guys as well. Okay, so what about sensory seeking? That's what everybody wants to know. So sensory seeking is a term that is used to refer to a child who seemingly needs more input, right? They need to move more, they need to touch more, they need to bump and crash more, they need to smell, they need to lick, they need to put things in their mouth, they need to make a lot of sound, right? So there are some kids that are sensory cravers that need it, literally need it in their body. It's a reward based difference, actually, that the reward based part of the body needs something all the time. I will tell you that from a sensory motor perspective, there are not many kids who are truly sensory cravers that, if they're doing these things, actually need more input. Okay. So it's a behavior that tells us more. And it's really, really important to, and if you can't tell, this is like a soapbox of mine. It's really important to not always just say, oh, they need this input, I'm just going to give them more of it. You can try it as a strategy, but what you should see happen is that they become more regulated because of it, right? So if they become more regulated because you gave them more input, then they actually do need it, right? So then it is that they might be under responsive and they need more input. They need to fill up that system. But if you feel like they always need it and they never did get enough, then chances are that that's not actually why they're doing it, right? So what could be happening is we see sensory seeking behaviors when kids are over responsive because they're anxious, right? They're fidgeting, they're moving, they're pacing because they're anxious about something. They're uncertain about a sensory experience and they're very nervous about it. So they're moving because of it, or they're touching things because of it. There may also be that the child is looking for stability. So if we have postural weakness, it's easier to be in motion than it is to be still. So in order to sit in a stable position, we have to activate far more postural muscles than we do when we're moving. So if we have anybody who's in that posture bucket that we just talked about, they are going to look like they're seeking movement because it's easier to be moving. And in fact, we see a lot of kids who the only way they can stop is to crash into something, right? Or fall. They literally move and they fall, and that's how they stop. And then they get up and they're moving fast again until they fall again or bump into something again, because it takes a lot of core stability to grade that stop, right? So they may actually need a stable base. They may need a chair that has armrests and feet flat on the floor, and, or a bean bag that encompasses their whole body so that they can find that stability. They may need to sit on your lap and feel your stability provided from your body. The other thing that it could be is motor planning differences, right? So when we see, so they actually they look like they're seeking input, but they're actually seeking a plan. And what this looks like is I go to one thing and I play with it for a little while, and then I put it down and I go to another thing and I play with it for a little while, and then I go to another thing, right? So it looks like they need to move, and it looks like they need to touch things, but really they might move because they ran out of ideas, right? Or something didn't work, right? I start to play with this toy. I don't know what else to do with it. Oh, well, I'll go to the next toy. Or I play with this toy and now this happened and that's not what I expected to happen. I have no idea what else to do. So I'm just going to go to the next toy, right? So this is really just something to say, it's another thing, kind of like the sensory sensitivities that are out in the universe. Like I said, search sensory processing and everybody's over responsive. You search sensory processing, sensory seeking comes up, and it's like, give them more input, right? Which is sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. So if you have somebody like that in your house or in your practice or in your classroom, just go back to those areas and wonder more, right? Okay, so I see this behavior. What of these other things could be happening for this child? Okay, so how does this impact social emotional development? So as I said at the beginning, we never see a child with sensory processing differences that don't have a social emotional difference as well. And I will say never, because I've never seen somebody that has a sensory processing difference that doesn't have some form of social emotional challenge that goes along with it. So we see shy kids, right? We see our kids and I should give a little bit of background on my kids here, inspired by my own kids, because I felt like, and I don't know, I guess what age, maybe like first or second grade, there was always this like, oh yeah, so-and-so, he's the shy kid, or, oh, so-and-so, he's bossy. Oh, so-and-so, he's really quiet, right? There's always like this name for kids that kids like to do. It's just comfortable for them to kind of understand kids by giving them some sort of attribute. And I guess to some extent we all do that, but that's the inspiration for these sensory kids. So our shy kids are usually our over responsive kids. They're overwhelmed by the busyness in the environment. They experience things more than the rest of us. They're hypersensitive to other people's emotions. They hear things, feel things, smell things that nobody else does, right? So that's a lot of input that they're taking on. So essentially, to join play with other people, I need to take on all of that extra input that I'm taking and figure out how to coordinate myself to engage and not be worried about the interaction involving one of those things I'm uncomfortable with. Okay, so really that's too much and I'll just play by myself. Okay, or I'll watch for a long time and then maybe with the support of my caregiver, I can go, right? So there's this increased challenge of separating from an adult, from a caregiver figure, because as caregivers, we tend to accommodate and they know that. Okay, this I've actually changed and I sometimes don't have the right slide in here. So, but sometimes, it's lazy because that happens all the time. I hear people say they're just lazy, right? Unmotivated, particularly as the kids get older, 9, 10 and older. Younger kids, the term that often comes up is daydreamer, right? They're daydreaming all the time. So they can look unmotivated. They can prefer to lay around. They don't notice what they can do in the environment. They're slower to respond to directions. And they're always kind of one step behind, right? And these are our under responders, right? So if you have somebody in your life that you feel like you've said these things about, you can start to think about that under responsive category. Our confused kiddos are our sensory discrimination guys, right? So things just don't efficiently work for them. They may attempt things and they do it inefficiently. They might use unusual objects, right? Like these are the kids where you watch them play or you watch them do something and you wonder, like, why would they do it that way? Or why would they choose that thing? So the ideas mismatch the task. And also in conversation, what they offer to you in conversation doesn't quite match the flow of what everybody was already talking about. Right. So there's this mismatch in conversational flow, just like there's a mismatch in motor skill as well. And the big one here for our kids with discrimination difficulties as they get older, when we expect our kids to be able to differentiate whether they're a little mad or a lot mad, these guys can't differentiate. It's either mad or not because they don't understand that gray area in their body. They don't understand moving a little bit more, a little bit more, or a lot, right? That grading of movement and that pacing of action doesn't is not processed accurately. So when we're asking them to understand this range of emotional experience, they have no reference point to that. Our needy kiddos are our posture kids, right? So our posture kids are our kids who need help far longer than you think they should, right? They're just not strong enough to do what we think they should be able to do. Now, a tricky part here sometimes is that people will say, but he's really strong, okay? And posture, you think of weak. That is true sometimes because they're either all or none, right? They use every bit of strength that they have to do something, to open something, to push something, to move, and then they're on the ground, right? They fatigue out super quickly because they've used all of their whatever they've got in order to do that. So in a classic presentation, it's more the opposite, where there is this weakness, this tendency to give up, difficulty sustaining longer participation in anything, either a conversation, an interaction, or play, wants to be held often, and is just really floppy when they're around their peers. Our scattered kids are our motor planning guys, right? Where there's a difficult time in completing the task. There's difficulty in figuring out the right sequence in order to do things. So they can, like I mentioned before, jump from one thing to another. They can sort of start to jump into your story, or they could be telling you a story and it's completely disjointed, right? There's like this happens and then this happens, but like this doesn't connect to that logically. Or they're stuck in a detail of one part of the story and lose a picture of like the beginning and the middle and the end of what they're trying to say to you. So our bossy kids usually are either our over-responsive kids or our motor planning kids. And both is because they need it to happen the way they would need it to happen, right? If we're over-responsive and I control the situation, then it's going to happen in a way that I know I'm safe. Okay. I know I'm safe because I'm asking things to happen in a certain way. Therefore, I know exactly the sensory experiences I'm going to have. If I'm a motor planning guy and I'm bossy, it's because if I tell you how things happen, then I know I'm going to be successful. Okay. So if I'm the director of this play, I'm going to give myself a role that I know how to do. And if you're the director of the play, you might ask me to do something that I don't know how to do, and then I'm not going to be successful, right? So it's this need to feel safe and successful that brings about this there's basically a compensatory strategy of being bossy because it works. If you do everything the way that I ask you to do them, then I know exactly how I'm supposed to fit in this world. So usually our parents will talk about these kids being very demanding, right? I need the blue bowl, I need the red cup, and if that doesn't happen, then I have a total meltdown. Okay, so our hyperactive kids are our sensory seekers, right? We need to know why. They could be cravers, right? They could need the input, but they also could be any of these other ones we just talked about. They could be hyperactive and because they're anxious and they're over responding. They could be hyperactive because they don't have postural stability and they need to be on the go, or they could be hyperactive because they don't have the plan and they need to find the plan. But these are just constantly in motion. And oftentimes we'll hear the term bull in a china shop, where they're just kind of crashing and bumping into everything. Okay. So I recently added this part because I feel like it helps kind of zero in on the things that we wonder about, right? So, and the things that we get as in my practice, the main concerns, right? The main concerns that people call with are not typically my child's processing sensory information differently, right? It's usually attention, hyperactivity, anxiety, emotional regulation, social skills, or defiance, right? These are our biggies. And there are many reasons for these challenges. Sensory could be a part of it, right? It could be a part of it. I'm not saying that sensory is the reason for all of these challenges, but it's nice to know that we can consider it as a possibility for some of these. Okay, so the way that this goes, and when you look at it, when you get your handout, is goes from sensory responsive to sensory under responsive to posture to motor planning, right? Of the explanation why. So if we're having difficulty with attention, what could be happening from a sensory perspective? What could be happening from an over responsive perspective is that they're overwhelmed by the sensations around them. So they're hyper focusing on what's happening around them for their body, and unable to share attention with what they should be paying attention to. If they're under responsive, they may not even be registering what's being offered to them, right? So we can't pay attention to something that we're not noticing is there. Or if we're under responsive, we're overusing our visual system to guide our own actions because our proprioceptive system is not giving us that feedback. So we can't watch what we're doing and watch what you want us to watch at the same time. Our posture guys will sometimes be concentrating on keeping themselves upright, right? I can't maintain my body in an upright position unless I'm figuring out how. Holding on to the sides of the chair, wrapping my legs around the bottom of the chair, holding my head up like this on the table, laying on somebody. So I'm focusing on that. And so I can't pay attention to everything around me. Or our little guys maybe can't orient their body to pay attention, right? So our one thing I forgot to mention for posture is the W sit, right? Sitting out with your legs wide and in a W shape. And what that does is supports the body so we don't have to use our core. But what it also does is significantly limit our range of motion. So you could try it now. I can't see you. Or you could try it later. If you sit in that position and you try to rotate around, you can't do it, right? So if we have a 2-year-old sitting on the floor playing in a W sit position and our parent is behind them trying to get their attention by saying their name, they're not going to be able to turn around to see them and pay attention to what they want them to pay attention to. So can they orient their body to actually pay attention? And then our motor planning guys could be confused on how to do it, right? I'm not sure how to do it. So it could look like they're not paying attention, but in fact, they're just not sure how to sequence the steps. So hyperactivity, we just talked about. So I won't go over that again, and you guys will get this so you can have it for review. Anxiety, we've mentioned from an over-responsive perspective, right? So we are worried about the sensations that we're going to experience. So we are anxious. So I have to say that right now, there is a lot of anxiety in this world, as all of you probably know. And what is happening clinically here is we're getting a lot of calls about sensory over-responsivity. And when I ask them more questions, what we learn sometimes is that it's actually that they're anxious about what's happening in the world and they're over responsive because of it. So when we're anxious, our sensory systems are hypervigilant. So what we want to know, big question is this historically a challenge or is this a new challenge? Because if you're just presenting with hypersensitivity to sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, it's probably because you're anxious, not because you're actually having that, you're having that experience, but the treatment would be for the anxiety, not for the sensory over responsivity. From a posture perspective, our under responders are not anxious, right? Because they're not registering anything to be anxious about. But our posture kids do get anxious because we see a pattern of unresolved fears and concern, where a child should not be worried about that anymore. They're still worried about it, scared of the dark, scared of monsters, that kind of thing. We also see kids who are worried that they're not going to be strong enough to do what is being asked of them, right? So they're worried about not being able to keep up, not being able to do what they're being asked of. And similarly, from a motor planning perspective, our kids who are aware that they can't organize in sequences and do what's being asked of them, when they're given multi-step directions, immediately get worried because they're not going to be able to carry them out. Our emotion regulation we've talked about throughout, so I won't go too much into this, but I like to have it here as like a summary. Our over responders are anxious because of the sensations. Our under responders, also, again, similar to not being able to discriminate a range of emotion. Sometimes our under responsive kids don't feel the emotional experience until it's huge, right? Until they are so angry that their body can finally register all of those little experiences to understand that they're angry. Then they're exploding, right? Because there's no ramp up. They don't feel the ramp up, they just feel the big. Our posture kids are constantly tired and fatigued. They work so hard to do everything that we do so so easily. So the fatigue challenges their emotion regulation. Our motor planning guys are confused and frustrated all the time. I don't know why I can't do what everybody's asking me to do. I don't know why I can't play this game the way my peers are playing this game. So they're frustrated, they're angry, they're also embarrassed about their performance. And overall, our sensory kids are straight up exhausted because no matter what their profile is, they're trying harder than we ever know to cope with the day to day. And lastly, our defiance. Our defiance guys are typically, we want to wonder about what could be the sensory reason. So over responders don't like what you're asking them to do because it's aversive, right? Our under responders might not get enough information in their body to know what to do. So they say no. Our posture guys are the perception, it's like a cost benefit for them, right? That's going to take too much effort and it's kind of not worth it, right? Because I need to use so much more effort than you do to do that task. And then, so a lot of times with our motor planning kids, no or I can't is the first thing. Before, what we hear from parents all the time is they didn't even hear me, right? I just started to ask them to do something and they said no. And usually it's from just historically not being able to be successful, right? So then when they're approached by somebody to do something, their emotional experience is that they're not going to be able to do it, right? So they're saying no and I can't. So our social skills are impacted pretty significantly for our sensory kids, right? So we mentioned our over responsive kids are shy, right? They're not jumping into social interactions. Our under responders are kind of in their own world. They're not recognizing and registering the opportunities for social interaction. Our posture guys, they just can't sustain the play, right? As their age matched peers. So their age matched peers are playing in a way that requires much more strength and endurance than they have. And then our motor planning kids they don't know how, right? There's a game going and they cannot picture how to get themselves into that play. Or their play skills in general are delayed. Like I mentioned, they might be stuck in an earlier play pattern because it's 1 or 2 steps and successful than these longer play patterns. Or they might be bossy, right? And try to control the play, and then their peers don't want to play with them. Okay, so what can we do about it? And I wish we had more time to go over into lots of strategies, but definitely recognizing that this is a piece of it is a big one. Certainly reaching out to a sensory trained OT, there's many of us, but just when you call an OT to ask what is your training in sensory processing, because it is a full certification process far beyond what our school is. So our school, we get 1 class in sensory processing, 1 class in 3 years of school. So unless you did a internship at a sensory practice and got a specialized training there, or did the best case scenario is some sort of certification. And you can ask that. They should be able to tell you that. But as a parent or as a professional right now, understanding why some of these behaviors are happening and validating that for the child is a great place to start, right? To say, oh gosh, that is really tricky for you, or oh man, I see you trying so hard to do this. Or oh man, that sound was really overwhelming, right? Just noticing with them what their experience is will help them cope with it better, right? Will help you get into this conversation about it. Even our little kids, the littlest kids we see will comment, even if they can't, you don't think they can understand what you're saying. It's the emotion that you exude when you say something like that that you understand, that even the youngest kids can pick up on. And we usually use the word tricky, and even our little guys will say it to us, like, that was tricky. So for anything, right? If it was an over response, it can be tricky. If it was something difficult to do, it was tricky. If it was a surprised event, it was tricky. Okay, so then what we can also do is watch them, right? Watch what they are doing to regulate themselves. How do they calm themselves when they're overwhelmed? How do they upregulate themselves when they're underwhelmed? And is there something that is there a strong sensory system for them? What do they like to go towards? And how can we use that to help support regulation? Co-regulation is a huge one, right? So if they are over aroused and over responsive, we need to remain calm. This sounds very like, well, yeah, of course. But I will tell you, as a parent of a child who is over responsive, every time I know that he's going to put a piece of clothing on that is going to be uncomfortable, I go like this, right? Not what I'm supposed to be doing, right? Because then he sees me and goes, this is definitely going to be uncomfortable, right? And before he even tries it, I validated to him that that is something that he should be worried about. So it's super important to monitor how your response is. For our under responsive guys, we need to be up and exciting, right? Our affect needs to be super big and exaggerated so that they're coming up and out into our world and into engage with us. So I share my activities very often on our website, our Facebook page, and our Instagram. There's tons of resources on them. And the book that I highly, highly recommend is from my mentor, Sensational Kids, from Lucy Jane Miller, that goes into depth in each of these areas and does also offer us, ideas to try. There's a second book called No Longer a Secret that I forgot to write on here. That also is a great one as far as like what to do about this. This is our place. We're in Rockaway. We have a sensory gym that has, now we have 2 more rooms than this. This is an older picture, but we play all day because play is what helps our sensory kids do what's hard for them. We conquer dragons in the castle room and blast off into space in our space room, and battle pirates in our pirate room, and really help our kids to feel strong and brave in order to overcome some of these challenges. So I will stop sharing and go check out the chat here, and also take any questions that you have in the next about 10 minutes.
If anybody has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Michele, I'm wondering, do they still use items like sensory vests and weighted blankets?
You can.
Okay.
You certainly can. Yeah. And again, it's kind of the same thing as the seeking of input. Like, you just need to know why you're using it. So if somebody is moving around a lot and you feel like you want to put a weighted or a compression item in use, but they're actually moving because they're posturally unstable, that's going to be really hard for that child, because then now it's adding more weight for them to hold up. Right. So if we put a weighted vest on a child who has postural instability, then we're challenging that postural system even more than it was already challenged. So we just want to know why we're using it and make sure we're using it for the right reason.
Okay. Any questions? Question is, what suggestions do you have for a seeker who is very self-directed and kind of avoids things? Kind of avoids the things that do give her input when it is suggested.
Yeah. So usually that's an indicator of a posture difference. At some point, there's some sort of postural piece. Usually if we need input, but we need to do the work to get the input, like if there's specific work that we're giving them to do and they don't want to do it, it's usually because it's hard for them. So there's either a motor planning component that I don't know how to do the thing that you're asking me to do to get the input, or it's too hard. It's taking too much effort. So just think about making it a little bit simpler and actually truly using the child's passions and interests are the biggest way to get them to do anything, and to really truly enter play. So on our website, we have play-based strategies for each area, for each sensory system, because getting into play is the best way that we can get our kids to try anything that's going to be difficult for them.
There's another comment that says, my child still uses those sorts of things such as weighted blanket, chewy tubes for his mouth, I'm not sure, a Zybe,
Z-Vibe, yeah.
Z-Vibe, okay, which helps with sensory issues to the mouth.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And with any sensory tool, you just essentially you want them to see them become more regulated, calm, and organized when using them, right? Like that's the ultimate goal. So if you provide some sort of support, and you don't see a change, then that's not the right support, right? If it's the right sensory support, there should be a change in the behavior. Gum chewing is great if they'll do it, especially ADHD. Yeah, I see that one down there. Though, what is your opinion on the use of medication to alleviate some of the symptoms that occur with SBD, including anxiety, such as antidepressants or stimulant? Okay, so so what we know about the crossover between sensory and these other diagnoses, anxiety and ADHD, is that sensory processing itself, at least right now, does not have a medication that will address the sensory part of that. If there is an ADHD and anxiety component and you're given medication for ADHD and anxiety, then you should see those symptoms alleviate. And I say that because often if you don't, right? So if your child has ADHD and they're given a medication, especially ADHD, because it's been like 40 plus years in research of ADHD medication. So it's very well researched as far as the outcome, then it might not be ADHD, right? It might be more sensory. And we conservatively, there's a 40% overlap between sensory and ADHD. Conservatively, that's of the people who returned the research, right? The questionnaires and things like that. So we know that sometimes it's both. We know that sometimes it's one or the other. It's really hard to differentiate until you start to try things. So if your child is taking ADHD medication, but you're not seeing any change in hyperactivity or attention, then you might want to look more into the sensory side of things. Should I give my child too many sensory tools, or will that be confusing? Yeah, I mean, just like any intervention, you don't want to give too much at one time because you want to know what works, right? So it's good to isolate a certain option, try it, and then try something different, right? It's nice. It's a better idea to do like one or two things at a time so that you really know what's actually working. The cleft lip question is out of my specialty. I really can't answer that one.
Okay. Okay, I don't see any other questions. I think we've answered them all. Michele, I would like to thank you for taking the time and coming to share your expertise with us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I would also like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you all next week at the Lunch and Learn next Thursday. Everybody, I wish you a good week.
Bye. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.